Hello starfarers, and welcome back to the Galaxy Telecast. For today's transmission's topic, I'll be giving you a guide on every dimension that exists in the Metroid universe, because surprisingly enough, there are actually quite a handful of them present. I'll give a brief description of what the dimension is and how its existence is known, along with any unique properties the dimension brings to the table. Of course, I'll be talking about the alternate dimensions, as the normal universe doesn't really have anything going for it that's worthy of discussion here. Last of all, I'll be including non-canon dimensions as well, so I'll specify any dimensions which come from non-canon sources. But without further delay, let's begin. The first dimension I'd like to discuss is the one that I believe most of you are familiar with, given its prominence. The Dark Dimension, as I call it, is the alternate dimension that hosts Dark Aether in Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. The existence of the dimension beyond Dark Aether itself is known to us, because the Metroid Prime 2 manual states that Dark Aether is within an alternate dimension, not a dimension in and of itself, a point which has been restated at least once. There are several unique properties that the Dark Dimension possesses. For starters, its very nature as it exists is something of a mystery, as the Leviathan that struck Aether is known to have created Dark Aether, but whether the impact simply created Dark Aether inside an already existing dimension, or if the impact created an entirely new dimension is unknown. As for the properties of the dimension itself, its most notable trait is the poisonous air of Dark Aether, an atmosphere so poisonous that it makes quick work of Illuminoth, Space Pirates, and even Samus's Varia Stew, and continues to damage her even after she obtains an upgrade made to neutralize this issue. The atmosphere was such a big problem that the Luminoth created light crystals and other light-bearing entities to adequately combat the Ing on Dark Aether. The Dark Dimension is also the only known natural habitat of the Ing, a highly aggressive species that requires hosts to survive on Aether's normal environment, and are capable of trans-dimensional warping and attacks, though I'll cover this a bit more later. The end of this dimension, much like its origins, is somewhat of a mystery. At the end of Metroid Prime 2, Samus destroys Dark Aether and the Ing along with it, but there's no confirmation as to whether or not the dimension went down with the planet as well. With that said, it's more likely that the dimension did indeed meet its end here, as the Ing are completely destroyed, never to be seen again. If only the planet had been destroyed, at least some of the Ing could have escaped and continued their attempts at conquest, only now on new worlds. If this is truly the end of the Dark Dimension as a whole, then the origin of the dimension would likely be the Leviathan impact, not just the origin of Dark Aether, as the planet, being the source of the dimension, brought with it the dimension and its destruction, which is something we see happen in Metroid at other times as well, like how the destruction of Phazon's source, Phase, results in the annihilation of all Phazon. I'll leave it at that though, since there's no confirmation either way. The Dark Dimension has some objects in which it splits the atoms up 50-50 between Dark Aether and Aether, leaving said objects in a state of trans-dimensional flux. The important thing to note here is that the objects are in both dimensions at once, rather than being between dimensions, because as you'll find out later, there is both trans-dimensional and interdimensional flux in this series. That's all I have to say about what I've dubbed the Dark Dimension though. Let's move on to some of the more obscure stuff. The next dimension I'd like to discuss is the Infinity Void, which appears in Metroid Prime Hunters. The Infinity Void is, according to Olympic lore, which is how we know of the dimension's existence, a vast parallel dimension made of formless antimatter. Vast undersells the true size of the Void in all likelihood, as it's more than possible that the parallel dimension is infinite in size given the name, along with the fact that the dimension is parallel to the main Metroid dimension, which is infinite in size. The unique properties of the Infinity Void outside of its makeup of antimatter would be what's contained within the realm. It's inside this dimension that the Olympic race sealed away the Oubliette, a prison they built specifically to keep the Seal Sphere, in which held Garea, from escaping and bringing forth oblivion unto the universe. It's Garea, inside the Seal Sphere, inside the Oubliette, inside the Infinity Void. The Olympics truly spared no expense when it came to imprisoning folk, but I digress. The dimension can only be accessed in a highly intriguing and multifaceted process. In order to reach this place, Samus must gather the 8 Octoliths, bring them to Alanos, and fire the Olympic Cannon, at which time the cannon fires bursts of polarized antimatter at faster-than-light speeds, at specific coordinates and frequencies, which opens a dimensional rift to the Infinity Void. The reason the Oubliette and the Seal Sphere were sent to this dimension was to ensure that if Gorea somehow escaped, or if someone released him by accident, he would not be able to cause any harm upon the main dimension. What intrigues me most is that this method of reaching the Infinity Void, although incredibly difficult, is technically replicable should one possess the technology and power sources to match the Olympic weapons in Octolith, leaving the door open to a possible return to the dimension, though I doubt it would end up happening given Hunters is one of the least remembered games in the franchise. That's all I have to say about the Infinity Void, but did you know that this may not be the only extra-dimensional void present in Prime Hunters? The Stronghold Void is actually a recurring stage in Metroid Prime Hunters, appearing 8 separate times as you travel there each time you go to collect an Octolith, and these rooms always hold boss fights, either a Cretafid or a Slench. If this is to be treated as an alternate dimension, the evidence of its existence is backed by a 1-2 punch of details. First, this scan, on top of the obvious fact that we can go to and interact with the area like the previous 2 dimensions that I talked about, proves that these areas do indeed exist. Second, if this is an alternate dimension, then this can't be the Infinity Void, as it's stated that the only way to reach the Infinity Void is by using the Olympic Cannon, which is not what's used to enter these voids. What is used to enter these voids are Olympic artifacts, which can be used to open each portal once the player has collected one of each type of them. The 3 types of Olympic artifacts which combine to open the portal are the Atomatter artifact, which holds schematics for atomic mapping and allows the portal to disassemble the molecular structure of objects within the teleportation device. The Cartograph artifact holds the coordinates of its respective stronghold, and the Binary Subscripture artifact contains the precise frequency of the Stronghold Transporter's spectral transponder, which allows teleported objects to get from one place to another. The reason that the Stronghold Void's status as an alternate dimension is up in the air is because it's left open to interpretation whether this is truly an alternate dimension, or simply chambers deep within the planet that can't be reached by conventional means. The idea that the strongholds are simply buried within the depths of their respective areas is supported by the fact that some of the strongholds match the environment of their area, like how the strongholds in Artera are covered in ice. It can't be confirmed one way or the other though. For what it's worth, I think the argument could easily be made for either scenario, so I can't really say with confidence that this is or isn't an alternate dimension, though if it is, then I should clarify that the 8 strongholds would not be 8 separate dimensions. It would be one dimension, the Stronghold Void, containing the 8 strongholds within itself. The Stronghold Void doesn't really have many unique features. The only ones I can think of are that these strongholds guard the Octoliths used to reach the Infinity Void, and that the strongholds always trigger a timer after the Octolith is taken, forcing the player to reach their ship before time runs out. There's really not much to this realm outside of the debate as to whether or not the Stronghold Void even is an alternate dimension, so it's time we move on to the next dimension. This next dimension, or rather collection of dimensions, comes from a non-canon source, meaning that it doesn't exist within the official lore of the series. Coming from the Nintendo Comics system, Captain N, the Game Master, the Locker is a sort of vacation destination for bounty hunters. It's a storage center spanning 350 levels featuring hotel rooms, diners, recreational facilities, a medical complex, a trading bazaar, and walls 100 meters thick. However, none of that holds a candle to the namesake of the Locker. There are thousands of hotel rooms built for galactic bounty hunters to stay in, each room adapted to the hunter's homeworld conditions. What makes these rooms so ridiculous is their method of storing the hunter's personal belongings. The way a hunter's souvenirs are stored is by using a warp zone connecting to each individual locker, and by this warp zone, the room is connected to its own dimension. Remember that each room has its own locker, and that each locker has a warp zone to a unique dimension all to itself. This means that the locker is host to, and confirms the existence of, literal thousands of dimensions. Although the type of dimension these are isn't specified, it's still an absolutely ridiculous number of dimensions to just casually drop in for a random setting in a comic not even related to the Metroid canon. I mean, this isn't even a non-canon Metroid story. The only connection to the franchise is that Samus stays there during the comic. Like I said, this isn't a Metroid comic, this is a Captain N comic with Metroid characters in it. These innumerable dimensions are connected to Metroid only in the most loose and non-canon way, but it's also got to be among the most obscene things that has ever been associated with the series, in-universe at least. Aside from the warp key granting access to the dimension, there's almost nothing known about these dimensions, so there's nothing else to speak about here. With that, we can move on to discussing the last couple dimensions. Before I start on those, I should mention that I saved these upcoming dimensions for last, because they aren't simply alternate dimensions or pocket dimensions like the previous entities, or at the very least, there's a chance that they aren't. With that out of the way, let's move on. The other dimension that many Metroid fans no doubt know is something of an oddity. It's a dimension, but also not in a way at the same time. Debuting in Echoes, the interdimensional void is a dimension between dimensions, serving as the way to get from Aether to Dark Aether since they aren't able to be reached by conventional means. We know the dimension exists simply because it's a prominent part of Metroid Prime 2, acting in-universe as Luminoth-made portals that allow them to travel to Dark Aether, and as a gameplay mechanic serving the same purpose for the player, along with being a thinly veiled loading screen. While the exact way this void works isn't always explained, there does seem to be a way that this dimension generally works. As the object that is transported goes through the void, the molecular structure is decompiled, sent through the void to its destination, and is then reformed as it was prior to entering the void. It should be noted that specific technology is required, typically portals, to go through the interdimensional void safely, as a scan from Echoes states that if not for the dark and light portals, living beings would be irreparably scattered throughout the void, lost between dimensions forever. However, a few creatures are exceptions to this rule. The Ing are capable of creating their own portals, which is how they can travel to Aether unassisted, and how they were able to access Aether before the Luminoth created their own portals. Some members of the Ing take the ability to create portals a step further, as a few types of Ing can summon light portals, taking energy from light Aether and using it to fire light energy at their target, like the Warrior Ing. Emperor Ing takes this even further, as he can summon more than 3 portals at once, which seems to be the limit for other Ing. He can send objects to and back from Aether, and he can even put his tendrils through the portals, allowing the tendrils to go through a beginning portal to Aether, then through another portal back to Dark Aether, which he does to throw his enemies off and prevent them from knowing where his attack will come from. The Crawlee are a creature capable of warping out of local time-space, so they presumably travel to Aether via the Void to avoid predators. Echoes also uses the Void in the form of light shafts, which upon obtaining the light suit will transport Samus to either previously inaccessible parts of a room, or to teleport between Aether's temples, and finally to grant access to the Sky Temple in Dark Aether. The Dark Burst, a special weapon from Prime 2, is said to open a highly unstable dimensional rift, ripping apart the molecular structure of objects caught in its blast radius, pulling them into a dark dimension, and their subsequent oblivion. This description is nearly identical to that of the portals, with the only major difference being that objects do not make it safely when faced by this weapon, so I believe it can be assumed that the dark dimension this item sends enemies to is simply the interdimensional void. And no, this isn't sending objects to what I call the dark dimension, since the weapon can be used all the same on Dark Aether. The existence of this void is known and it exists in Echoes, but I believe it exists in other games in the series as well. Metroid Prime Hunters has you travel to both the Stronghold Void and the Infinity Void, though I can't say for certain that the interdimensional void is used in either case, as Samus is able to physically fly her ship into the oubliette after the Olympic Cannon opens a rift to the Infinity Void, and once again, I couldn't say for sure whether the Stronghold Void is an alternate dimension or not, though if it is, then it would most certainly utilize the interdimensional void. An instance of the void being used that I cite with confidence is the wormholes found in Metroid Prime 3 and Federation Force. The wormhole in Metroid Prime 3 is created by Leviathans firing a special type of beam, causing dimensional rifts which the Leviathan travels through to cross great distances. The wormhole reopens at the Leviathan's destination, where the Leviathan promptly leaves the wormhole and returns to standard space. This is without a doubt the work of the interdimensional void. unless there's just some other interdimensional void lying around, then this is no doubt the Leviathan opening a portal to the void to use as a shortcut to arrive at its target destination faster than it could by way of conventional travel. This would also explain how Phazon Metroids and the Telecast are capable of warping out of local space-time, much like the Crawley from Echoes. Similarly to Corruption, there's a wormhole used by the Space Pirates and Metroid Prime Federation Force to bring ballistic missiles to their last remaining factory, capable of producing ballistic missiles to their base of operations on Talvania. The wormhole technology in question is completely unexplained, but just like the Prime 3 wormholes, unless there's just a whole nother interdimensional place, then it's gotta be using the same void found in Echoes. The last potential instance of this void's appearance that I believe in is found in the use of teleportation systems found in both Samus Returns and Dread. These methods of transportation allow Samus to travel across large distances near instantaneously, either to any previously activated teleportation station in Samus Returns, or to the teleportal of the matching color in Dread. The portals are extremely similar in function to the previous portals and wormholes that have been discussed, so I believe that these teleportation stations are pieces of technology utilizing the interdimensional void, much like the previous methods of teleportation mentioned. So all in all, between the Dark and Light portals, Light Shafts, Dark Burst, Stronghold Void, Infinity Void, Wormholes, and Teleport Stations, there are several ways in which the interdimensional void is reached, all of them safe except the Dark Burst. However, even if the rest of these examples somehow all didn't utilize the void, then its existence at the very least would still be confirmed by way of being shown in Echoes. I think I've said my piece about this void, so it's time to move on. There is one confusing matter that I'm having trouble pinpointing. What I speak of as lower dimensions, or objects of the series that exist within less than 3D spaces. Unless I'm mistaken, there is one instance where less than 3D objects are simply visible, and one recurring instance of actual sub-3D interaction. The less than 3D objects that are simply visible come in the form of the objects that can't be seen unless you're using the Dark Visor in Echoes. Specifically, the Dark Visor, to quote its inventory entry, can detect one-dimensional objects that are normally unseen. This ability is separate from its ability to highlight enemies as a targeting aid. The 1D objects that the scan refers to are the objects you view when on the side of Aether opposite of the dimension the target occupies, like being in Aether and viewing the Ing that are holding the Sky Temple keys on Dark Aether, where they appear only as simple lines, lacking depth or height. I don't believe this is really a separate dimension. I believe that these objects are simply visible in the form of 1D imagery, rather than actual interaction with lower dimensional objects. This is sort of the same thing as how some objects, like bomb slots, are split between Aether and Dark Aether, where you can see what is missing on the opposite Aether, only this time it's not a 50-50 split, but rather the 3D being is only on one planet, and one dimension of that being is visible on the other planet with the Dark Visor. The other instance of lower dimensions being a part of Metroid is the one that entails actual interaction, not just an upgrade highlighting cross-dimensional objects in a certain way. You may be surprised when I tell you that you've probably seen this lower dimension in action before. In fact, it's been hiding in plain sight this whole time. You see, as this panel from the prequel manga shows, Samus' ship gets around by exiting and re-entering three-dimensional space, allowing the ship to travel unbelievable distances within a matter of moments. This would explain how Samus, and for that matter, other bounty hunters, managed to get around so much quicker than the Federation or Space Pirates are able to, as the Federation fleet in the same manga requires 20 hours to get from Jagrod to Zebes, and the fleet in Prime 3 needs a wormhole to reach Phase in a timely manner. It's possible that this technology is only available to a select few members of Galactic Society, perhaps because the technology is very expensive, or simply rare. The reason I say this instance of lower dimensional interaction has been hidden in plain sight is because it's appeared in multiple games up to this point. It appears at the beginning and end of Prime 1, a detail kept in the remaster. It appears as Samus travels to the Tetra Galaxy at the beginning of Prime Hunters, and we see this travel method used once again at the end of Prime 3, on top of the instance in the manga that we see. As for how these ships can convert to less than 3D space and revert back to 3D space, I couldn't tell you. Though I can say that this interaction is with lower dimensional space and not higher dimensional because of the space that this is taking place in. You see, the prevalent theory on higher dimensions, string theory, or its variants like superstring theory, say in short that the universe we occupy is an island within an 11th dimensional universe, with the other 6 spatial dimensions being rolled up into little compact loops the size of 10 to the negative 33rd power in centimeters, too small to observe. Since this travel method of the ships in Metroid being used clearly covers massive distances, then it can't be traveling via higher dimensions based on real-life theories, or at least the most prominent among them. I am willing to admit that I am way ahead of my depth when it comes to such high-level physics, as I can imagine all of you watching this transmission are. These are complex theoreticals that people a lot smarter than me spend many years studying and later forming into theories like the one I've discussed, in only the most extremely brief manner possible. So perhaps there's another prevalent theory that would align with what I've shown you to be higher dimensional interaction, but I've yet to see it. Fictional stories can, of course, do what they want in the making and properties of higher dimensions and what constitutes such a thing within the narrative, but there's simply no evidence, let alone proof, that any higher dimensions that the gunship could interact with exist in Metroid, where standard 1, 2, and 3D space do. So until and unless such higher dimensions are added into the series, which I doubt, then this would be lower dimensional travel. As for how this would work, my guess would be that the transportation method warps the ship into one-dimensional space, allowing the ship to make a perfect line straight towards the target coordinates. It's like a beeline on steroids. I could say that this is supported by the opening cutscene in Hunters, where we see the ship transform into a simple line, flashing out of existence, and then popping back into 3D space, now in the Tetra Galaxy. This visual detail is shared in the other instances of the ships traveling this way too. The thing that is clear about this method of travel is that the ship is leaving 3-dimensional space for a time, and what I believe is also true is that this fits no definition of a higher dimension, which would leave it to be lower dimensional travel, where I presume it would be utilizing one-dimensional space to make the travels of the ship as short as possible. Just to make sure I've covered my bases, no, that scan from the manga is not taken out of context, as this is the first page of the chapter, and the previous chapter ended before Samus and company left for Zebes, so the one page I showed you kinda is the context. There's nothing more to be said about this utilization of what is most likely lower dimensional travel, so let's move on. Much like the Ing, Crawlies, and Phazon Metroids, among others of course, the Chozo Ghosts are capable of phasing in and out of local time-space. Also very akin to the Dark Visor tracking Crawlies, the X-Ray Visor is capable of tracking Chozo Ghosts. I wanted to address this separately because there's a scan that adds some confusion to the mix. The scan reads, to quote, "Things bound to earthly shapes are temporal and frail. Existing in a single dimension, they are fragile, vulnerable, and ultimately mortal. However, not all things obey this law. Shapeless, they wait beyond the realm of perception, emerging only when one arrives who can feel their presence. Such is the will of the Chozo. Our will to defeat the evil seeping into this planet remains. We desire only to see the darkness meet its end. The will of the Chozo has no mind or reasoning of its own, though. This will be the entrusted one's trial." The reason I say this is complicated is because this text is deliberately written in a way that makes it highly interpretable. I'm sure there are more ways to interpret this, but I'm just going to share 3 that I thought of. One interpretation is that this passage is simply metaphorical prose regarding the will the Chozo possess. The spirit of the people is not a living thing, but it lingers in the world and resides beyond death, existing in both spaces. Their will, unlike animals or plants, or anything of the like, lacks tangible form, and because it lacks physical form, it is unbreakable. Of course, being a spirit and not a physical form, it cannot be felt ordinarily, but it can be felt by certain people who gain such a spirit. I'm not sure how many of you will resonate with this analogy, but if you've played any team sports before, You know how when you're on a team that wins a lot, you see one of your teammates is putting in a lot of effort into getting better, and you get this invigoration? Like, you could just feel it in the locker room. You and your teammates, everybody in there, they have this added confidence, determination, morale, things of that like. It's typically referred to in sports as having a winning culture. So if you've played on a sports team that had a winning culture, you probably know what I mean. Well, much the same as that, those who are connected to the lands or its peoples can feel the spirit of the Chozo that once lived here within them, invigorating them and giving them strength. The last line is a bit tricky, because in this metaphorical reading, it wouldn't literally be addressing a ghost, but I think this can be read as the obstacles the Chozo have put in front of the Entrusted One's path, the Chozo artifacts, which makes sense, as a different scan mentions them pouring their will into the 12, which of course refers to said artifacts. As for the ghosts themselves, this metaphorical reading wouldn't make for an alternate dimension, and as such, I would say that they simply turn invisible, changing to a lower frequency and wavelength so as to land on the X-ray portion of the visibility spectrum, which in turn allows the X-ray visor to see the ghost. A more literal reading of the passage would suggest a simple alternate dimension. The passage describes how the Chozo view things in only one dimension, and how they themselves are beyond the realm of perception. This sounds strikingly similar to the Dark Dimension from Prime 2, down to the point where Chozo ghosts can only be seen with the X-ray visor, the same way that some objects on the other dimension of where you are in Prime 2 can only be seen with the Dark Visor. Of course, the Entrusted One's trial would be fighting these ghosts, as they have no mind or reasoning, only blind aggression towards potential assailants of their home. Of course, by existing in two dimensions at once, they are not bound to a single dimension, and they describe these beings of a single dimension as temporal, frail, and mortal, because whatever other dimension they are in hosts their undying spirits, which don't die because, well, they're spirits. Time doesn't really affect them because they don't age. The final interpretation is similar to the previous reading, except in its interpretation of the dimension that the ghosts occupy. Because the text describes the dimension that Samus and company occupy as temporal, frail, and fragile, it's possible that this dimension is outside of not just the local space-time, but out of the temporal dimension entirely. Now, the fact that this Chozo lore only mentions temporal frailty makes it hard to determine whether it's outside of space-time entirely, but this interpretation would absolutely put it outside of time itself. Perhaps this dimension shares the same spatial dimensions as the normal realm, but it exists outside of the temporal realm, or perhaps it is completely separate from space-time. Either way, if this final interpretation is to be believed, then this separate dimension definitely doesn't fit the bill for a simple alternate dimension, the way the Dark Dimension or Infinity Void do. All of these interpretations are at least somewhat valid, as they can all be formed on the basis of what's being said within the text, and thus can't completely be discounted. As for which one I think is more likely, I'll go with the second interpretation. Just looking at this interpretation on its own, this is 100% the description that fits the most with what's happening. The hopping between two dimensions and the ability to see them with the X-ray visor is exactly like the Dark Visor and dimension hopping on Aether and Dark Aether. Conversely, the first and third proposals both have more notable flaws. The first interpretation's biggest flaw is that the metaphorical reading ends up completely ignoring the literal ghost flying around, which, with a more literal interpretation, would easily be addressed by the last two sentences. As for the third interpretation, I'm not completely opposed to it, same goes for the first one of course. However, I find it unlikely due to the retcons and revisions that have been made to Prime 1 over the years. Why these retcons are important to me is because of one scan in particular. This scan, dubbed Exodus, says the following: "We Chozo are departing now, after so many years in peaceful seclusion here on Talon 4. When we came, this place was a refuge for our spirits, a civilization built from native materials, bereft of the trappings of our technology. We were linked to the land here, kindred to the plants and animals, far away from the machines we have become so dependent on. And so we leave it now, pristine, a testament to the mortal forms we no longer need. We have drawn the veils of space and time aside, and are withdrawing beyond the illusion. But we will never forget this, the most sacred of our homes, and we will remain ever watchful. This scan makes it very clear that the Chozo ghosts are outside of the temporal dimension, unlike the last scan, and on top of that, it also makes it clear that these ghosts and their dimension resides outside of space as well. It's because this logbook entry makes it so clear that I find option 3 unlikely. The fact that the developers had a scan that definitely puts this dimension outside of space and time, and made the deliberate and conscious choice to remove it from subsequent versions of the game, let alone that they retconned it just a few short months after the initial and very rushed version of the game came out, tells me that the dimension being outside of or beyond space-time is not what's happening here. If it was, the developers would have just kept this scan in the game. It takes more effort to change something than it does not to change something, and the developers went out of their way to remove this information from canon, which is enough to tell me that this dimension does not fit the third interpretation. Since I've brought them both up now, I'd like to interject quickly and mention that both the X-ray visor and dark visor allow Samus to attack Ghost, Ing, and other creatures that have warped out of local space-time. This is a weird trait of theirs, as using these doesn't actually put you in the same dimension as these enemies, it just allows you to perceive them. If someone were to view the battle without these visors, they'd see Samus firing and hitting, well, nothing. The fact that you can see these enemies doesn't explain how you're able to shoot them while you're in the main universe and they're in an alternate dimension. Since no explanation is given, I'll simply chalk this up to an ability of the power suit, and by extension, Samus, since she's connected to her suit. It's just one of those weird, wacky, and inexplicable abilities that comes with being a sci-fi universe, or as we Metroid fans like to call it, bird magic. But I digress. Let's get back to the larger topic here. Now that I've established what this alternate dimension most likely is, I will gladly take the liberty of giving this realm an unofficial name. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Spectre Sector. So that begs the question, are there any other creatures residing within the Spectre Sector? Well, while it can't be confirmed outright, it is in all likelihood that the other ghosts present in the series also occupy the Spectre Sector. Phantoon is described as being incapable of existing in only one dimension at a time in some concept art in the art gallery for Metroid Other M, with its true form being unknown. So Phantoon is likely existing in both the normal dimension and the Spectre Sector at the same time, unlike the Chozo ghosts that go in between one realm and the other. Another ghost the player encounters in Super Metroid as well is the Covern, and if you've played Super Metroid you might know that if you shoot the Covern enough, it will disappear, but won't stay down for long. It's likely that when the ghost takes sufficient damage, it retreats to the Spectre Sector for a time before it reappears in the standard dimension to attack again. This would be more like the Chozo ghost than Phantoon, as they aren't being seen in both the Spectre Sector and the normal dimension at the same time. It's possible that the Ruins test accesses the Spectre Sector as well, which is why you can't interact with it until it attacks, much like Phantoon. Though I'm unsure as to whether this boss character is actually a ghost or just a spectral image emanating from the mural. With all the ghosts in the series covered, the nature of the dimension they either are confirmed to or most likely exist in uncovered, and most importantly a catchy name acquired, I think it's time that we move on from the Spectre Sector and onto our final dimension that needs to be discussed. The Spectre Sector. What a name. The last dimension that I need to discuss with you all is the most special of all the dimensions in Metroid. Why it's so special is not because it's between other dimensions, like the interdimensional void, nor could it possibly be a lower or higher dimension, like what the gunship travels through, or the Chozo Ghost Realm. Rather, the reason that this dimension is so special is simply because it's superior to all the others in every single way, much like the game that it comes from. Anyone listening to this broadcast with more than half a brain cell already knows exactly what I'm talking about. The Pinball Dimension. This dimension, though largely unexplained, seems to be an alternate universe where Samus is a pinball and the rest of the universe is a series of pinball boards. though otherwise the events of the timeline play out the same. Sadly, given that Prime Pinball is a non-canon game, this means that what is objectively the best dimension in the series is not actually a part of the series. Though at the time Fuse Games, now known as Silverball Studios, made Prime Pinball, I don't blame them, but rather Nintendo and Retro Studios for this heresy. They were jealous, because they knew that none of their trash could compete with the spherical miracle that is Prime Pinball, let alone on a relatively minor, throwaway story beat for lore sakes like Dimensions. They cast away pinball to the realm of non-canonness so that they wouldn't constantly feel the insurmountable pressure of trying and failing to top Silverball Studios' magnum opus. Cowards. That's what they are. Cowards. Alright, now that the more serious matters such as the Spectre sector and the pinball dimension are out of the way, I can get back to the less important things, like the conclusion of this broadcast. In conclusion, I have found what is so far 5 alternate dimensions in Metroid, or at least the canonical ones, those being the Dark Dimension, the Infinity Void, the Interdimensional Void, Lower Dimensional Space, which can be accessed via starships, and the Spectre sector, along with potentially one more in the Stronghold Void. There's also thousands of non-canon dimensions thanks to the Locker, plus another in the form of the GOAT, aka the Pinball Dimension. I by no means am perfect though. It's possible that I missed a dimension that exists, or perhaps I misclassified a dimension or two that I did count, or maybe I counted a dimension that really isn't one. If you believe I made a mistake along those lines, or if you have any thoughts you'd like to share with me, please submit your comments to the digital reply box down below. Station feedback is always appreciated, as it helps the channel to grow and improve with time. That will be all for today's transmission. Thank you all for tuning in. If you only remember one thing today, remember the best thing, the pinball dimension. And I'll see you next broadcast.